The silk felt like liquid moonlight against Clara's sterling skin, but it weighed as much as a suit of armor. 30 yards of hand-stitched Chantilly lace trailed behind her, a gossamer river that 5 bridesmaids had spent the last 20 minutes meticulously arranging. In the grand bridal suite of the Sterling estate, a sprawling neoclassical fortress perched on the cliffs of Newport, the air smelled of expensive lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of hairspray. Clara looked at her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling gilded mirror. She didn't recognize the woman looking back. The woman in the mirror was a Sterling. She was a brand, a legacy, a carefully curated masterpiece of public relations. Her dark hair was swept into a structural updo that felt precariously tight, held in place by a diamond tiara that had once belonged to a Russian Grand Duchess. "You look adequate," a voice boomed from the doorway. Clara didn't need to turn around. She saw her father, Arthur Sterling, reflected in the glass. He stood with his hands behind his back, his tuxedo crisp enough to cut glass. At 65, Arthur was the undisputed king of global logistics and shipping. He didn't have friends, he had subsidiaries. He didn't have a family, he had a succession plan. Adequate. Clara managed a small, tight smile. "I thought this dress cost more than a mid-sized yacht, father." "The cost is irrelevant," Arthur said, stepping into the room. His footsteps were silent on the Persian rug. He adjusted his cufflinks, solid platinum with clinical precision. "What matters is the image. Today, the Sterling name merges with the idea of stability. You are marrying a man of talent, a man who represents the new money of architectural genius. It softens our edges." Clara felt a familiar prickle of irritation. "I'm marrying Julian because I love him, father. Not because he softens our edges." Arthur's eyes, cold as Atlantic sea water, met hers in the mirror. For a second, a strange shadow crossed his face, not guilt, but perhaps a flicker of calculation. Of course. Love. A very convenient motivation. He checked his Patek Philippe watch. 10 minutes. "Don't smudge your makeup. The governor is in the front row, and the New York Times has 3 photographers stationed at the altar. Everything must be perfect." Without a touch on the shoulder or a word of fatherly affection, he turned and marched out. Clara took a deep, shaky breath. She closed her eyes and conjured the image of Julian Vane. Julian was her sanctuary. They had met 18 months ago at a rainy gallery opening in Soho. He hadn't known who she was, or so he'd said. He had been standing in front of a minimalist charcoal sketch, looking slightly rumpled in a corduroy jacket that had seen better days. He was an architect, brilliant but struggling, a man who cared more about the soul of a building than the profit margin of a skyscraper. For the first time in her life, Clara had felt seen. Julian didn't look at her and see the Sterling billions. He saw her love for obscure poetry, her secret fear of public speaking, and the way she liked her coffee far too bitter. He was the only thing in her life that her father hadn't handpicked. Or so she believed. "Time, Miss Sterling," the wedding coordinator whispered, peeking through the door. The walk to the glass pavilion was a blur of flashbulbs and hushed whispers. The pavilion was a marvel of modern engineering, a cathedral of crystal built specifically for this day, overlooking the crashing white foam of the ocean. Inside, 500 of the world's most powerful people sat on velvet-cushioned chairs, their jewelry refracting the afternoon sun like 1,000 tiny prisms. As the heavy oak doors swung open, the orchestra began the first swelling chords of Wagner's bridal chorus. Clara took her father's arm. His bicep felt like a marble column, unyielding and cold. She focused her gaze forward, past the sea of faces she barely knew, to the end of the long, white-petaled aisle. There he was. Julian Vane stood at the altar, looking devastatingly handsome in a custom charcoal suit. The sunlight caught the honey-brown highlights in his hair. As she approached, he gave her that specific, lopsided smile, the one that always made her heart skip. He looked nervous. His hands were clasped in front of him, and he was blinking rapidly as if overwhelmed by the spectacle. He's doing this for me, Clara thought, her eyes stinging with tears of relief. He hates these crowds, he hates this opulence, but he's standing there because he loves me. When they reached the altar, Arthur Sterling took Clara's hand and placed it firmly into Julian's. It felt like a transaction, a physical handoff of property. Arthur leaned in, whispering something to Julian that Clara couldn't catch. Julian nodded solemnly, his jaw tightening. The ceremony was a masterpiece of tradition. The bishop spoke of unions, of sacred bonds, and of the merging of two souls. Clara barely heard the words. She was lost in Julian's eyes. They were a deep, warm amber, and in that moment, they seemed to hold all the honesty in the world. I, Julian Vane, take you, Clara Sterling, to be my wedded wife. His voice was steady, resonant with an emotion that sounded exactly like devotion. When it was her turn, Clara spoke her vows with a fierce, defiant clarity. She wasn't just marrying a man, she was claiming her life. She was telling her father, and the 500 people watching, that she had found something that couldn't be bought. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the bishop declared. You may kiss the bride. Julian stepped forward, his hands framing her face with a tenderness that made her breath hitch. He kissed her deeply, a kiss that tasted of mint and promise. As they turned to face the crowd, the applause was deafening. The wedding of the century was a success. Clara beamed, clutching her bouquet of white peonies, her head resting briefly on Julian's shoulder. She felt like the luckiest woman alive. She had escaped the gilded cage. She had won. She didn't notice the way her father was watching them from the front row. He wasn't smiling with joy. He was smiling with the quiet, terrifying satisfaction of a man who had just closed the most successful deal of his career. The reception was held in the Great Hall, a room so large it had its own climate. Tables were groaned under the weight of beluga caviar, lobster thermidor, and vintage champagne that cost more per bottle than a teacher's annual salary. You did it, Mrs. Vane, Julian whispered into her ear as they moved toward the head table. He squeezed her hand. Are you happy? Impossibly, Clara replied, leaning into him. I just want to get out of this dress and away from all these people. Just us. Soon, he promised, kissing her temple. I just have to make a few rounds. Your father insisted I speak to the board members of Sterling Global. He says it's expected. Clara sighed. Even today, he's working. Go ahead. I'll go find some flat shoes. These heels are killing me. Julian disappeared into the throng of tuxedos, and Clara made her way toward the private wing of the mansion. She needed a moment of silence. She needed to breathe air that didn't smell like perfume and ambition. She slipped into the quiet, dimly lit corridor that led to her father's study. It was a shortcut to the guest suites. The heavy mahogany door to the study was slightly ajar. Clara paused. She shouldn't be in here today. This was her father's sanctum, the place where he moved the pieces of the world like a grandmaster on a chessboard. But she was parched, and she knew he kept a carafe of chilled mineral water on the sideboard. She pushed the door open quietly. The room was empty, illuminated only by the orange glow of the setting sun filtering through the heavy velvet curtains. The scent of old leather and expensive cigars hung thick in the air. She walked toward the desk, but as she passed the heavy credenza, her silk train caught on a slightly open drawer. With a soft thud, the drawer slid further out, spilling a few stray documents onto the plush carpet. Great, Clara muttered, bending down to retrieve them. She picked up a heavy, cream-colored folder. It was thick, stuffed with legal-sized papers. At the top, in the distinctive, bold font used by her father's private legal firm, were two words that stopped her heart. Project Stability. Underneath, in smaller print, Terms of Agreement, Julian Vane. Clara frowned. Julian. Why would Julian have a file in her father's private study? Maybe it was about the wedding expenses? Or a gift Arthur had set up for his architectural firm? She opened the folder. The first page was a wire transfer confirmation. Origin, Sterling Holdings Diversified. Destination, Vane Architectural Designs LLC. Amount, $15 million. Date, October 14th. Clara's blood ran cold. October 14th. That was 3 days before Julian had accidentally bumped into her at the Soho Gallery. She turned the page, her fingers trembling so hard the paper rattled. It was a contract. A formal, binding legal contract. Section 1.1, the recipient, Julian Vane, agrees to enter into a romantic pursuit of the subject, Clara Sterling, with the intent of legal marriage within an 18-month window. Section 1.2, payment structure. A total sum of $50 million shall be paid in 4 installments. Installment 1, upon initial contact. Installment 2, upon formal engagement. Installment 3, upon the signing of a restrictive prenuptial agreement. Installment 4, upon the successful completion of the wedding ceremony. Clara felt the room begin to spin. The air in the study, once cool, now felt suffocatingly hot. She flipped to the back of the document. There, at the bottom of the final page, were 2 signatures. The first was her father's, the sharp, aggressive scrawl of Arthur Sterling. The second was elegant, precise, and hauntingly familiar. It was the same handwriting that had written her 1,000 love notes over the last year. The same hand that had just slipped a wedding ring onto her finger. Julian Vane. Attached to the back of the contract was a sticky note in her father's handwriting. It simply said, "Transaction complete. Asset secured. 06/12. Today's date." Outside, in the Great Hall, the orchestra began to play their first dance song. The muffled sounds of cheering and laughter drifted through the vents, sounding like a mockery. Clara stood in the center of the dark room, clutching the $50 million proof of her own betrayal. The liquid moonlight of her dress now felt like a shroud. She wasn't a bride. She wasn't a wife. She was a line item in a budget. And the man she loved wasn't a husband. He was an employee who had just earned his final bonus. The project stability folder felt heavier than the diamond tiara pressing into Clara's scalp. In the silence of Arthur Sterling's study, the ticking of the grandfather clock sounded like a countdown to the end of the world. Outside, the muffled vibrations of the bass from the ballroom thrummed through the floorboards, a rhythmic, celebratory heartbeat that felt like a mockery of her own shattering pulse. Clara stood frozen, her eyes darting across the clinical lines of the contract. It wasn't just a single payment. It was a choreographed performance. Exhibit A, Initial Engagement Strategy. Exhibit B, Emotional Anchoring Protocols. She felt a bile-like bitterness rise in her throat. Her mind, usually sharp and analytical, began to flip backward through the last 18 months like a film reel being played at high speed. Every spontaneous moment, every coincidental encounter, every whisper in the dark, they weren't memories anymore. They were line items. She remembered the night Julian had proposed. It had been on a windswept cliff in Maine, under a blood-orange moon. He had looked so vulnerable, his voice cracking as he told her she was the only thing in his life that made sense. She had cried, thinking she was the luckiest woman on earth to find a man who wanted her for her soul, not her ledger. Now, she looked at the date on the proposal milestone bonus check. Payment 3, $10 million, disbursed upon acceptance of marriage proposal. The check was dated 2 days after that night in Maine. He hadn't been nervous because he was asking for her hand, he was nervous because he was closing a $10 million deal. The room seemed to tilt. Clara reached out to steady herself against her father's mahogany desk, her manicured nails digging into the wood. Her wedding dress, the goddess of the sea gown that the fashion magazines had been speculating about for months, felt like a straitjacket. She looked down at the white silk and saw only the price tag her father had paid to wrap her in it. "Is everything all right, Clara?" The voice was soft, melodic, and precisely the one she didn't want to hear. Clara didn't jump. She didn't scream. A strange, icy calm settled over her, the kind of stillness that precedes a localized apocalypse. She slowly turned around. Julian stood in the doorway. He had discarded his tuxedo jacket, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal his forearms. He looked relaxed, his hair slightly tousled from the wind outside. He held 2 glasses of champagne, the bubbles rising in golden streams. "I missed you at the head table," he said, stepping into the room. He didn't see the folder yet. He was smiling, that lopsided, boyish smile that had once been her favorite thing in the world. "Your father is currently lecturing the Prime Minister on trade routes, and I thought we could make a break for the gardens before." He stopped. His gaze fell on the open drawer, then on the cream-colored folder in Clara's hand. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. The golden light of the setting sun caught the edge of the papers, illuminating the word contract in stark, black letters. Julian's smile didn't vanish, it dissolved. It was a slow, agonizing transition from warmth to a blank, professional mask. He didn't drop the champagne glasses. He set them down on the sideboard with a steady hand, a gesture so calm it was more terrifying than a shout. "Clara," he said. Just her name. No darling, no sweetheart. "How much was the Soho meeting worth?" Clara asked. Her voice was a ghost of itself, thin and brittle. "The rainy day. The charcoal sketch. The way you knew exactly which obscure 19th century poet I loved. Was that in the briefing notes, Julian? Did my father provide you with a dossier on my heart?" Julian didn't look away. That was the most painful part. He didn't have the decency to look ashamed. He leaned against the doorframe, the shadow of the man she loved disappearing to reveal the architect of her destruction. "The Soho meeting was 15 million, he said quietly. The honesty hit her like a physical blow. She had expected a lie. She had wanted a lie. She wanted him to tell her it was a misunderstanding, that the folder was a forgery, that he loved her. But the man standing before her wasn't her husband, he was an asset manager. 15 million, she repeated, a hysterical laugh bubbling in her chest. "I must be very difficult to love if it takes 15 million just to get you to say hello." "It wasn't about you being difficult, Clara," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave. He took a step toward her, but she lunged back, putting the desk between them. "Don't," she hissed. "Don't you dare play the part anymore. The curtain is down. The check is cashed." "My firm was dying, Clara," Julian said, his professional mask flickering for the first time. Vane Architectural was 3 weeks away from a forced liquidation. Your father approached me with a solution. He didn't just offer money, he offered a legacy. He told me you needed someone stable. Someone who could handle the sterling pressure. He told me it was a partnership." "A partnership?" Clara shouted, her voice finally breaking. She shook the folder at him. "This isn't a partnership. This is human trafficking with a floral budget. You sold your life, and you sold mine. Every time you kissed me, Julian, were you counting the zeros in your head?" Julian looked at her then, his amber eyes dark and unreadable. "At first. Yes. I was an architect looking at a blueprint. I had a job to do. I learned your habits, I memorized your favorite books, I practiced the way I looked at you in the mirror. It was the most complex project I'd ever taken on." He took another step, and this time, he didn't stop when she recoiled. "But then," he whispered, "the project changed. You aren't a line item, Clara. You're a force of nature. About 6 months in, I stopped looking at the schedule. I forgot about the milestones. I forgot that I was being paid to love you because, God help me, I actually did. Stop, Clara wept, the tears finally spilling over, ruining the adequate makeup her father had been so concerned about. You can't say that. You signed the final installment today. You signed it today, Julian. While I was putting on this veil, you were checking your bank balance. I signed it because your father wouldn't let me see you until I did, Julian countered, his voice rising in frustration. He owns the air we breathe right now, Clara. He made it very clear that if I backed out, if I told you the truth, he would destroy not just my firm, but every person I've ever employed. I was trapped. You were rich, she snapped. There's a difference. She looked down at the contract again. Her eyes caught a clause near the bottom, section 4.4, in the event of a breach of confidentiality by the recipient, all assets shall be forfeited, and a non-disclosure penalty of $100 million shall be applied. She realized then the depth of the cage they were both in. Her father hadn't just bought a groom, he had bought a jailer who was also a prisoner. He's coming, Julian said, his head turning toward the sound of footsteps in the hall. He'll be looking for us for the first dance. Clara wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing black mascara across her cheek. She looked at the folder, then at the man she had married an hour ago. The love was still there, a dull, throbbing ache beneath the betrayal, but it was poisoned. It was a beautiful house built on a foundation of rot. The first dance, she whispered. He wants his show. Clara, listen to me, Julian said, reaching out and grabbing her shoulders. His grip was firm, desperate. We can leave. We can take whatever is left and go. We don't have to play his game. Go where, Julian? With what money? The money he paid you to lie to me. She wrenched herself away from him. You're an architect. You should know. You can't fix a structure this broken. You can only tear it down. The door to the study swung open. Arthur Sterling stood there, the silhouette of a king. He looked at Clara's tear-streaked face, then at the folder in her hand, and finally at Julian. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look remorseful. He looked like a man checking the progress of a construction site. The guests are waiting, Clara, Arthur said smoothly, as if he were discussing the weather. The orchestra has started the waltz. It would be a shame to waste such an expensive arrangement. Clara looked at her father. She saw the coldness in his eyes, the same coldness she now realized was in her own. She was a Sterling, after all. She had been raised by this monster. She knew how he thought. She knew how he moved. She looked at Julian, who stood silent and defeated in the corner of the room. Then, she looked back at the project stability folder. A new feeling began to replace the sorrow. It was a cold, sharp clarity. If she was a subsidiary, then it was time for a hostile takeover. You're right, father, Clara said, her voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. She walked to the mirror and calmly wiped the mascara from her cheeks, adjusting her tiara until it sat perfectly level. It would be a shame to waste all this money. She turned to Julian and held out her hand. Not with love, but with a cold, hard command. Come, Julian. We have a dance to perform. Julian looked at her hand, then at her face. He saw the shift. He saw the woman he had secured transform into the woman who would eventually destroy the man who hired him. He took her hand, his fingers cold. Clara. Don't speak, she said, her eyes fixed on her father. From now on, Julian, you only speak when I tell you to. You're a very expensive asset. I intend to get my father's money's worth. Arthur Sterling smiled a thin, predatory grin. That's my girl. Clara let Julian out of the study and toward the great hall. As they emerged into the light and the applause of 500 strangers, she didn't feel like a bride. She felt like a general walking onto a battlefield. The paper trail didn't end here. It was just the beginning of the ledger she was going to use to burn her father's empire to the ground. The heavy oak doors of the great hall swung open, and the world became a blinding explosion of white light and orchestrated joy. As Clara and Julian stepped onto the polished marble threshold, a wall of sound hit them. 500 people standing in unison, their applause rhythmic and thunderous. It was the sound of a successful merger. To the governors, CEOs, and socialites in attendance, they were witnessing the pinnacle of romance. To Clara, it felt like being walked toward a firing squad that used flashbulbs instead of bullets. Julian's hand was a leaden weight on her waist. Through the thin silk of her gown, his touch felt like a brand of physical reminder of the $50 million price tag etched into her skin. "Smile, Clara," Julian whispered, his lips barely moving as he kept a practiced, charming grin fixed for the photographers. "The drones are filming from the ceiling. If you look like you've been crying, the stock price for Sterling Global drops 2 points by Monday morning." Clara tilted her head back, offering the cameras a radiant, porcelain smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes were obsidian hard, dark, and reflecting nothing. "Is that what we're worried about now, Julian? The quarterly dividends? I thought we were celebrating our eternal union." The orchestra transitioned into a slow, haunting waltz. The singer's voice, a smoky soprano, filled the cavernous room. "I'd give the world just to hold you for a moment." The irony was so sharp Clara could almost taste the blood in her mouth. Julian led her to the center of the dance floor. The crowd fell back, creating a wide circle of shimmering jewelry and expectant faces. In the front row stood Arthur Sterling, a glass of vintage scotch in his hand, watching them with the detached pride of a man watching a high-performance engine he had just finished tuning. Julian took her hand and placed his other on the small of her back. They began to move. He was a perfect dancer, smooth, controlled, leading her with a grace that felt entirely natural. That was his gift, wasn't it? Making the artificial feel inevitable. "You're shaking," Julian murmured, pulling her an inch closer. To the audience, it looked like a moment of shared intimacy. To Clara, it felt like being pulled into a snare. "I'm not shaking, Julian. I'm vibrating with the urge to take the butter knife from the head table and see if you actually bleed, or if my father just filled you with cold, hard cash." Julian's jaw tightened, a small muscle leaping in his cheek, the only crack in his architect's facade. "I told you in the study. I didn't want it to be like this. I tried to tell you a dozen times, but Arthur had eyes everywhere. He had my firm bugged. He had my sister's medical debt bought up by a Sterling subsidiary. I was a project, Clara, but I wasn't the project manager. I was the site." "Oh, poor Julian," Clara whispered, her voice dripping with vitriol as they spun past a cluster of laughing bridesmaids. "The $50 million victim. Do you expect me to pounce on you with sympathy? You took the money. You signed the contract. You looked me in the eye every morning for a year and lied about why you were there. I loved you." He hissed, his grip on her hand tightening just enough to hurt. "You performed love. There is a difference. One is a gift, the other is a service. And tonight, the service is over. I own the contract now." The waltz swelled to a crescendo. Julian dipped her, his face inches from hers. For a fleeting second, Clara saw the man she thought she knew, the warmth in his eyes, the slight tremble in his fingers. But she couldn't let herself believe it. If she believed it, she was weak. And if she was weak, her father had already won. As he brought her back up, the applause erupted again. They bowed, a perfect portrait of marital bliss. "Now," Clara said, her voice like a razor. "We go to the tables. We speak to the stakeholders. And you will be the most doting, obsessed husband this room has ever seen. If I see even a hint of guilt on your face, I will call the lawyers before the cake is cut. The next 3 hours were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Clara moved through the reception like a queen overseeing a charnel house. She shook hands with senators, kissed the perfumed cheeks of elderly heiresses, and laughed at the dull jokes of her father's board members. Beside her, Julian was flawless. He fetched her water, he touched the small of her back at exactly the right intervals, and he spoke of their future home with a convincing, wistful passion that made Clara's skin crawl. "They make a handsome couple, don't they, Arthur?" Clara froze as she felt her father's presence behind her. Arthur Sterling leaned in, placing a heavy hand on her shoulder. "The best money can." Arthur caught himself, a small, dark glint in his eye. "The best the world has to offer. My daughter deserves nothing less than perfection." Clara turned to face him. She didn't flinch. "You've outdone yourself, father. Julian is exactly what you promised. He's efficient. He anticipates my every need. It's almost as if he were programmed for it." Arthur's smile didn't falter, but his grip on her shoulder tightened. "I only want your stability, Clara. This world is a chaotic place. Men like Julian provide a foundation. You should thank me for providing you with a structure that won't collapse under the weight of your temperament." "Oh, I intend to thank you," Clara said, her voice dangerously sweet. "I intend to show you exactly how much I've learned from your project stability. You've taught me that everything has a price, and everyone is an asset. It's a very liberating realization." Arthur narrowed his eyes. He looked at Julian, then back at Clara. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He had expected her to be broken, or perhaps to be a weeping mess that he could then fix with a stern lecture and a new trust fund. He hadn't expected her to turn into him. "Be careful, Clara," Arthur warned, his voice dropping to a low growl. "A foundation can also be a tomb if you aren't careful where you step." "Then I'll just have to make sure I'm the one holding the keys," she replied. By midnight, the guest list had thinned. The scent of expensive cigars and wilted flowers hung heavy in the air. Clara and Julian were finally led to the bridal suite, a palatial set of rooms at the top of the Sterling estate that overlooked the dark, churning Atlantic. The moment the door clicked shut and the valet disappeared, the silence became a physical weight. Clara walked to the center of the room and began unpinning the diamond tiara. She didn't wait for Julian to help her with the dress. She walked to the vanity, picked up a pair of heavy fabric shears she'd noticed earlier in the day for the flower arrangements, and reached behind her. "What are you doing?" Julian asked, stepping toward her. "Zip." She didn't unhook the dress. She sliced through the delicate lace and silk of the $200,000 gown, the shears making a jagged, violent sound. She stepped out of the ruined fabric, leaving it on the floor like a dead skin. Underneath, she wore a simple silk slip, her pale skin stark against the dark wood of the room. "The wedding is over, Julian," she said, sitting down at the vanity and beginning to scrub the makeup from her face with aggressive, frantic movements. "The performance is on intermission." Julian stood by the bed, looking at the heap of ruined lace. "You don't have to do this. We don't have to be enemies." "Enemies?" Clara laughed, a sharp, cold sound. "We aren't enemies, Julian. Enemies have a mutual respect for one another's power. You're an employee who committed fraud. I'm the employer who hasn't decided whether to fire you or keep you as a pet." Julian walked over to her, his reflection appearing in the mirror behind hers. He looked exhausted. The architect was gone, there was only a man who looked like he had lost his soul in a bad real estate deal. "I have the money, Clara," he said quietly. "The $50 million. It's in an escrow account. I haven't touched a cent of the previous installments. I was going to use it to pay back your father and tell you the truth tonight. I swear to you. Clara stopped scrubbing. She looked at his reflection. You were going to pay him back. With what interest, Julian? Do you think Arthur Sterling cares about the money? He has more money than God. He cares about control. He bought you so he could control me. If you pay him back, he'll just find another way to tighten the leash. Then we break the leash, Julian said, leaning down so his face was level with hers. You found the contract. You know the terms. But you missed the addendum on page 42. The one about the board of directors. Clara frowned. She hadn't reached page 42. She had stopped at the payment schedule. What addendum? Arthur didn't just pay me to marry you, Julian whispered, his voice urgent. He paid me to act as his proxy. In the Sterling Global bylaws, a married heiress's husband automatically gains a tie-breaking vote on the executive board. He didn't buy a son-in-law. He bought a permanent majority. The realization hit Clara like a bucket of ice water. Her father wasn't just managing her personal life, he was using her marriage to stage a legal coup of the company she was supposed to inherit. If Julian voted with Arthur, Clara would be sidelined in her own empire forever. He's going to use you to vote me out, Clara whispered, her eyes widening. He was, Julian corrected. But the contract only works if I'm loyal to the pair. If I'm not, if I transfer my proxy to you as part of a post-nuptial agreement. Clara turned around in her chair, her heart racing. The icy mask was still there, but behind it, the gears were turning. You're suggesting we use the marriage he bought to take away the thing he loves most. The company, Julian finished. I'll give you the vote. I'll give you the money. I'll give you everything. Just, don't look at me like I'm a monster. Clara looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the desperation. She saw the love that might be real, or might be the best lie ever told. She didn't know if she could ever trust him again. In fact, she was fairly certain she couldn't. But she didn't need to trust him to use him. She stood up, her silk slip whispering against her legs. She walked to the window, looking out at the black ocean. The gilded illusion was dead. The paper trail had led to a war room. Tomorrow morning, Julian, we start the honeymoon in Italy, Clara said, her voice steady. But we aren't going to Tuscany. We're going to Milan. I have a meeting with the rival shipping firms. And you are going to be my most loyal soldier. She turned back to him, a predatory glint in her eyes that would have made her father proud. The mask stays on for the world, Julian. But in this room, you are mine. Not Arthur's. Mine. Julian bowed his head. As you wish, Clara. The mask had cracked, but the woman underneath was far more dangerous than the heiress the world had seen walk down the aisle. The Gulf Stream G700 cut through the Atlantic clouds like a silver scalpel. Inside the cabin, a sanctuary of cream-colored leather, brushed gold accents, and the faint, persistent scent of expensive ozone. Clara Sterling sat across from her husband. To any flight attendant peering in, they looked like the picture of post-nuptial bliss. Julian was leaning forward, his hand resting near Clara's on the mahogany table. They were whispering. They looked like they were sharing secrets of a shared future. They were, in a sense. But the secrets weren't about children or summer homes. They were about corporate warfare and the legal dismemberment of a titan. He has eyes on this plane, Julian, Clara said, her voice barely a breath. She didn't look at him. She looked out the window at the endless blue of the ocean. The head of flight security is a Sterling loyalist. The Wi-Fi is routed through a private server in New York. Every keystroke you make on that laptop is being mirrored to my father's desk. Julian didn't flinch. He was currently typing a polite, gushing email to his sister about the wedding, a performance for the digital ghosts watching them. I know. That's why I'm using the encrypted partition I built into my firm's architectural software. He thinks I'm rendering a 3D model of a museum in Dubai. In reality, I'm mapping out the Sterling Global Board of Directors. Clara finally turned her gaze to him. The amber in his eyes was muted by the cabin's artificial lighting. She looked for a sign of the man who had held her in the rose garden, the man she had thought was her soulmate. He was still there, buried under layers of regret and professional precision. "Explain the proxy vote again," she commanded. "Clearly. No architectural metaphors." Julian closed a window on his screen and leaned closer. "The Sterling Global Charter is an archaic document. Your grandfather wrote it in the 1950s. He was a traditionalist, a misogynist, really. He didn't believe a woman should hold the chairmanship. So, he inserted a spousal alignment clause. It states that if a direct Sterling heir marries, their spouse is automatically granted a guardian vote on the board. It was meant to ensure that the husband would guide the wife's interests." Clara's jaw tightened. "So my father didn't just buy me a husband. He bought himself a puppet who could outvote me on my own inheritance." "Exactly," Julian said. "With my vote and his own shares, Arthur has a 51% majority. He can liquidate the company, sell off your shipping lines, or fire you from the executive committee whenever he wants. He's been waiting for this wedding for years, Clara. It was the final piece of his puzzle. The day we said I do was the day you officially lost your company. Unless," Clara whispered, her eyes flashing with a cold, predatory light. "Unless I sign a post-nuptial proxy transfer," Julian finished. "It's a legal loophole. If I voluntarily sign over my guardian vote back to you, the spousal alignment clause is satisfied, but the power resides with the heir. But we have to do it in a jurisdiction that recognizes modern marital equity over archaic charters. Like Milan. Hence the honeymoon," Clara said. "The Milanese theater." They landed at Linnet Airport under a drizzling gray sky that matched Clara's mood. A black Mercedes Maybach was waiting for them, driven by a man Clara recognized: Vincenzo, her father's most trusted driver in Europe. "Welcome to Milan, Mrs. Vane," Vincenzo said, bowing slightly. "Your father has arranged a private dinner at Krakow. He also mentioned that you might be interested in visiting the Brera Gallery tomorrow." "Thank you, Vincenzo," Clara said, her voice a perfect imitation of a pampered heiress. "But Julian and I are quite exhausted. We might just stay in the suite for the next 48 hours. You know how it is." She gave him a suggestive, conspiratorial wink. Julian played along, sliding an arm around her waist and pulling her close. Clara felt a phantom shiver, a memory of when this touch felt like home. Now, it felt like a tactical maneuver. Their suite at the Palazzo Parigi was a temple of marble and velvet. As soon as the bellhop left, Clara began her routine. She turned on the heavy brass faucets in the tub, letting the roar of water mask their conversation. She turned on the television to a loud Italian talk show. "We have 3 hours," she said, stripping off her trench coat. "Vincenzo will be reporting back to New York. We need to meet with the Moretti lawyers before the gala tonight." "The Morettis?" Julian asked, his brow furrowing. "Clara, they're your father's biggest rivals in Mediterranean shipping. If he finds out you're talking to them, he won't just fire you. He'll erase you. He already erased me, Julian. He turned me into a transaction," she snapped. She walked over to him, her finger jabbing at his chest. "You gave him the ink to do it. Now, you're going to help me find the eraser." Julian took a deep breath. "I've already contacted their lead counsel. We're meeting in the back of a tailor shop on Via Monte Napoleone. But Clara, the Morettis aren't philanthropists. They'll want a piece of Sterling Global in exchange for helping us bypass Arthur's legal blockade. I'm prepared to give them the Mediterranean routes," she said coldly. I'd rather own 70% of a kingdom than 100% of a cage. The shadow of the puppet master. The meeting was brief, clinical, and terrifying. In the back of a shop smelling of wool and cedar, Clara signed 3 documents that effectively declared war on her father. Julian signed the proxy transfer, his hand steady even as he knew he was essentially signing his own professional death warrant. If Arthur found out, Julian would never design so much as a doghouse again. When they returned to the hotel, the light on the suite's landline was flashing. A single message. One word. Call. Clara felt the old, childhood fear prickle at her neck. She looked at Julian. He looked just as pale. She sat on the edge of the bed and dialed the private New York number. It picked up on the first ring. The Duomo is beautiful this time of year, isn't it? Arthur Sterling's voice was smooth, like expensive cognac. There was no hello, no how are you. It's raining, Father, Clara said, her voice perfectly level. Is it? That's a shame. I hope it hasn't dampened Julian's spirits. He's been very quiet today. My security team noticed he wasn't in the Maybach when you went shopping on Montenapoleon. Clara's heart skipped. He was looking at some architectural archives nearby. He didn't want to bore me with blueprints. Blueprints, Arthur repeated. The word sounded like a threat. I hope he's focusing on the right structures, Clara. I've spent 40 years building the Sterling name. It would be a tragedy if someone, an outsider, perhaps tried to renovate it without my permission. What are you saying, Father? I'm saying that I just received a very interesting notification from the board's legal server. A spousal proxy inquiry. It seems someone is looking for loopholes. The silence on the line was deafening. Clara looked at Julian. He was watching her, his eyes wide. I don't know what you're talking about, Clara lied. Don't play the ingenue, Clara. It doesn't suit you. I raised you to be a shark, not a minnow. But remember this, I am the ocean. You can swim as fast as you want, but you are still in my water. There was a pause, and then Arthur's voice softened into something far more terrifying. I've decided to join you. I'll be in Milan tomorrow morning. We'll have a family breakfast. Julian, if you're listening, and I know you are, bring your laptop. We're going to discuss the merger of your firm into Sterling Global. I think it's time we brought everything under one roof. The line went dead. The point of no return. Clara dropped the phone. It bounced silently on the plush rug. He knows, she whispered. Julian moved toward her, his face a mask of desperation. He doesn't know everything. He knows we're looking, but he hasn't seen the signed transfer yet. The Moretti lawyers are holding it in escrow until the board meeting on Friday. He's coming here, Julian. He's going to corner us. He'll offer you more money, or he'll threaten your family again. He'll find the crack in the foundation. Julian grabbed her hands. They were ice cold. Let him come. Let him try. Clara, listen to me. I know I started this as a liar. I know I'm the reason you're in this position. But I am not his puppet anymore. I'd rather lose everything than watch him do to you what he did to me. Clara looked at him, searching for the truth. For the first time, she didn't see the architect or the employee. She saw a man who was just as trapped as she was. Why? She asked. Why risk it now? You have your $50 million. You could disappear. Because $50 million is the price of a husband, Julian said, his voice cracking. But you're priceless. And I'm not just saying that because it's in the script. I'm saying it because I'm a fool who fell in love with his mark. Clara leaned her forehead against his. For a moment, the war outside the door vanished. There was only the sound of the rain and their synchronized breathing. If we do this, she whispered, there is no going back. We aren't just taking his company. We're taking his life's work. He will hate us until the day he dies. Then let him hate us, Julian replied. At least we'll be free. Clara pulled back, her eyes hardening into the sterling steel her father had forged. Fine. He wants a family breakfast. We'll give him one. But he's going to find out that the asset he secured has developed a mind of its own. She walked to her suitcase and pulled out a fresh set of clothes. Not a wedding dress. Not a honeymoon negligee. A sharp, charcoal gray power suit. Julian, call the Morettis. Tell them the timeline has moved up. We aren't waiting for Friday. We're holding the board meeting tomorrow. At breakfast. The puppet master was coming to Milan. But he was about to find out that the strings had been cut, and the puppets were now the ones holding the shears. The sun rose over Milan not as a golden orb of hope, but as a cold, clinical spotlight hitting the spires of the Duomo. On the private terrace of the Palazzo Parigi, the air was crisp, smelling of espresso and the damp stone of a city that had seen empires rise and fall for 2,000 years. Clara Sterling sat at the circular marble table, her posture as rigid as the wrought iron chair beneath her. She wore a charcoal gray suit, the fabric so sharp it looked like it could draw blood. Across from her, Julian was a phantom of his former self. He hadn't slept. He sat with his tablet open, his fingers hovering over the send button of an encrypted file that would either liberate them or destroy them. He's here, Julian whispered. The elevator doors at the end of the terrace hissed open. Arthur Sterling stepped out, looking refreshed, vibrant, and utterly lethal. Behind him followed two men in dark suits, not bodyguards, but Sterling Global's lead internal auditors. Milan looks good on you, Clara, Arthur said, pulling out a chair with the practiced ease of a man who owned the air he breathed. A bit of rain adds character to the complexion. And Julian, you look like you've been working hard. Good. A husband's work is never done. Arthur snapped his fingers, and a waiter appeared instantly with a silver tray of poached eggs, smoked salmon, and a bottle of Krug champagne. We aren't here for breakfast, Father, Clara said, her voice dropping like a guillotine. Arthur chuckled, spreading a napkin across his lap. Nonsense. We always have time for a family meal before a merger. I've brought the paperwork for Vane Architectural. We're folding it into Sterling Logistics. By noon, Julian, you'll be the youngest senior vice president in the history of the firm. Quite a leap for a man who was facing bankruptcy 18 months ago, wouldn't you say? Julian's jaw tightened. He looked at Clara, then at Arthur. The bankruptcy was a result of Sterling Global squeezing my subcontractors, Arthur. You created the fire so you could sell me the water. I think we both know that now. Arthur didn't even blink. He took a bite of salmon. In business, we call that market correction. You were a talented asset in a weak position. I simply provided the capital to make you a strong asset in a dominant position. Now, let's talk about the board meeting on Friday. I've drafted the proxy instructions for your guardian vote. You'll be voting in favor of the Mediterranean divestment. Clara felt the coldness in her chest bloom into a flame. The Mediterranean divestment was her father's plan to sell off the heritage shipping lines, the very heart of the company her grandfather had built, to a private equity firm he secretly controlled. It was a massive embezzlement scheme disguised as a strategic pivot. The board meeting won't be on Friday, Father, Clara said. Arthur paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. He looked at his daughter, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. Oh? And why is that? Because it's happening now. Clara reached into her leather portfolio and pulled out a sleek, black tablet. She tapped the screen, and 3 windows appeared. Each window showed the face of a primary board member of Sterling Global, currently sitting in their respective offices in London, New York, and Hong Kong. Beside them, a 4th window opened. It was Lorenzo Moretti, the patriarch of the Moretti shipping empire. Arthur's face, for the first time in Clara's life, turned a shade of sickly gray. He dropped his fork. It clattered against the porcelain with a sound like a gunshot. "What is this?" Arthur hissed. "This is a quorum, Arthur," the New York board member said, his voice crackling through the speakers. "And according to the documents we received an hour ago, there has been a significant change in the voting bloc. I am the chairman." Arthur roared, standing up so abruptly his chair toppled over. "Any vote without my presence is a breach of the charter." "You are present, Father," Clara said calmly, taking a sip of her black coffee. "The bylaws allow for emergency digital attendance. And as for the guardian vote you were so keen on." She looked at Julian. Julian tapped his screen. "As of 8:01 a.m. Milan time, I have executed a post-nuptial proxy transfer. Under the 2024 European Marital Equity Act, which this jurisdiction recognizes, a guardian vote granted by a marital contract can be voluntarily returned to the primary heir without the consent of the chairman, provided it is done under a claim of duress or undue influence." Julian looked Arthur straight in the eye. "And I have submitted 50 pages of undue influence in the form of your wire transfers, your threats against my firm, and the original project stability contract." Arthur looked at the auditors behind him. They were looking at their feet. They weren't his men anymore, they were corporate observers. "You think this works?" Arthur spat, leaning over the table toward Clara. "The Morettis? You're inviting the wolves into the house to chase out the shepherd? They'll tear you apart within a year." "The Morettis haven't bought the company, Father," Clara said, her voice rising with a newfound authority. "They've signed a joint venture agreement. They provide the infrastructure, I provide the roots. In exchange, they've helped me buy back the 15% of shares you've been hiding in offshore shell companies. I now hold a 52% majority. With Julian's proxy, I am the controlling interest of Sterling Global." The silence on the terrace was absolute. Even the birds seemed to stop chirping. Arthur Sterling, the man who had treated the world as a game of Monopoly, looked at his daughter and realized he was no longer the player. He was a piece that had been removed from the board. "You're firing me?" Arthur whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "After everything I built for you? I did this for you, Clara. I secured your future." "No," Clara said, standing up to meet his gaze. "You secured your legacy. You didn't care about my future, you cared about your control. You bought me a husband because you didn't think I was strong enough to lead. You underestimated the woman you raised, Father. That was your only mistake." She leaned in, her voice a lethal whisper. "The auditors are here to escort you to the airport. Your personal assets are being frozen pending an investigation into the Mediterranean divestment. I've left you the estate in Maine. It's quiet there. You'll have plenty of time to reflect on your project stability." Arthur looked at Julian, his eyes burning with hatred. "And you think she'll ever love you now? You think she can look at you and not see the $50 million check? You're just a ghost in a suit, Vane." Julian didn't flinch. "I'd rather be a ghost with a conscience than a king with a contract, Arthur." Arthur Sterling, defeated and diminished, was led away by the auditors. He didn't look back. As the elevator doors closed, the weight of the Sterling empire shifted. It now rested squarely on the shoulders of the woman in the charcoal gray suit. The aftermath. Clara sat back down. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a hollow, ringing silence. She looked at the board members on the screen. "We'll resume the formal briefing at 2:00 p.m., she told them. "I want a full audit of the logistics division by Monday." She closed the laptop. Julian was watching her. He hadn't moved. He looked like a man who had just survived a plane crash, relieved to be alive, but unsure of where he was. "So," he said quietly. Is this the part where I leave? Clara looked at him. She saw the man she had loved, and she saw the man who had been paid to make her love him. The lines were blurred, perhaps forever. The contract is void, Julian, she said. The $50 million is in the corporate recovery fund. You're legally free of my father, and you're legally free of me. Julian nodded slowly. He stood up, reaching for his jacket. I'll have my things moved out of the New York apartment by the time you get back. I'll send you the keys. He turned to walk away. Julian. He stopped, his back to her. The board still needs an architect for the new Mediterranean hubs, Clara said, her voice softer now, but still firm. It's a massive project. It requires someone who knows how to build something that can withstand a storm. Someone who understands that a foundation isn't just about stone, it's about truth. Julian turned around. He searched her face for a sign of a trap, or a sign of the woman he had met in the Soho gallery. Are you offering me a job, Mrs. Vane? I'm offering you a partnership, Clara said. A real one. No contracts behind my back. No milestones. Just work. And maybe, eventually, we can see if there's anything left of the project worth saving. Julian looked out at the Duomo, then back at Clara. He didn't smile, not yet. But he sat back down at the table. He picked up his coffee, which was now cold, and took a sip. I think, Julian said, his voice steady for the first time in days, that we should start with the blueprints. Clara Sterling looked at the man her father had bought for her and realized that while the marriage had been a lie, the power she had found within it was the only thing that was real. She was no longer a daughter, a bride, or a subsidiary. She was the CEO. And for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she wanted to be.